The apartment building across the street was on fire again. Not the whole building, just the third floor, the corner unit, where someone had apparently knocked over a brazier sometime around the second hour of the night. The fire had been visible from the street for about 20 minutes before the first bucket brigade organized itself, and by the time the Vigiles arrived with their equipment, the fire had been largely contained by the simple expedient of several neighbors throwing water and sand until it stopped growing. The third floor corner unit was uninhabitable. The family who had lived there was now on the street with their possessions, negotiating with the building's owner about alternative accommodation and compensation. The building's owner was not feeling generous. This was Rome, approximately 60 AD, and this exact sequence of events, the fire, the bucket brigade, the negotiation with the landlord who was not feeling generous, had happened in this neighborhood on at least 4 occasions that Marcus Cornelius Secundus could remember, and he had been living in this particular insulae since he was 7. He was 29 now. Welcome to Dull Tales. Tonight we are going to Rome, not the dramatic Rome of the emperors and the Senate and the famous historical moments. We will touch on those because Rome is Rome and you cannot entirely avoid them. But tonight's primary destination is the other Rome. The noisy, chaotic, fish-smelling, perpetually slightly on fire Rome that 1 million people lived in daily. This is the Rome that nobody films. But it is the Rome that was actually there. Before we get into the streets, subscribe if Dull Tales is your sleep companion. It genuinely helps us keep going. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. And if you've been to Rome, tell me what part of the city felt most like the real thing to you. Let me ask you a few things first. What did ancient Rome smell like? Not the idealized Rome of white marble and noble speeches. The actual city, on a summer afternoon, in the middle of its own million-person daily life. How did 1 million people get their daily food in a city with almost no domestic cooking facilities? Because most Romans could not cook in their apartments. So where did the food come from? What time did Romans go to sleep, and what time did they wake up? And why is the answer to both of those questions significantly different from what you probably expect? Did ancient Romans have traffic jams? Because the answer is yes, absolutely, and the reason they did is funnier than you might think. What happened when you needed to use the bathroom in ancient Rome? And I mean this practically, not the engineering answer, the daily life answer. And what was the specific smell and sound and texture of the Roman street market at the second hour of the morning, when the city was at its most alive? Tonight we find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in Rome in approximately 60 AD, during the reign of Nero, who is currently more interested in performing on stage than in governing the empire, which the Senate finds frustrating and the public finds either amusing or alarming depending on their relationship to the theater. The city has approximately 1 million people in it. 3 of its neighborhoods are currently on fire to varying degrees. The fish market opens in approximately 4 hours. Let's go in. Let me start with the apartment building. The insulae, the apartment buildings of ancient Rome, were one of the most distinctive features of the city and one of the most dangerous. They were tall. Roman apartment buildings routinely reached 5, 6, and sometimes 7 stories, an extraordinary height for the ancient world, achieved by stacking floors on a ground-floor commercial level, using timber and concrete construction that was fast and relatively cheap and not especially safe. The upper floors were cheaper than the lower floors, the inverse of modern elevator building economics, because climbing 5 or 6 flights of stairs with everything you needed for daily life was a significant inconvenience that reduced the desirability of the upper floors regardless of the view. The ground floors were typically commercial, shops, taverns, bakeries, fullers, the various commercial operations that required frontage on the street. The families on the upper floors lived above this commercial activity, which meant they lived with the specific sounds and smells of the commerce below at all hours. The construction was often poor. The poet Juvenal complained about the thinness of the walls and the inadequacy of the timber beams, and the general sense that the building you were living in might choose to collapse at any moment. This was not merely poetic license. Buildings did collapse. The records of the imperial period include specific instances of insulae collapses that killed multiple residents. Fire was the other constant. Anxiety. Most Roman apartments had no cooking facilities. In a city of 1 million people, with millions of oil lamps burning through the night, with the occasional brazier for warmth or cooking in households that could afford the space and the risk, fire was a permanent background hazard. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, which burned for 6 days and destroyed between 1/3 and 2/3 of the city, depending on which ancient source you consult, was the most dramatic manifestation of this hazard, but it was not an isolated event. The city burned regularly on a smaller scale. Marcus lives on the 4th floor of his insulae. He has lived there in 2 rooms, since his father's death 10 years ago reduced the family from 3 rooms on the 2nd floor to the current arrangement. The 2 rooms are a front room that serves as living space and a back room that serves as sleeping space. There is a small window in the front room that looks onto the street. There is no window in the back room. He does not cook in the apartment. He has a ceramic oil lamp, a small chest of personal possessions, a sleeping platform with a straw mattress, and several pieces of furniture of medium quality that he is somewhat attached to. The apartment smells of the lamp oil and the building's general accumulated smell of people living in close proximity, and of whatever the bakery on the ground floor has been producing, which comes through the floor. He is woken, this specific morning, by the shouting about the fire across the street. He looks out the window. He assesses. 3rd floor, corner unit, the bucket brigade is already organized. The situation appears containable. He goes back to sleep. He has seen this before. Let me tell you about the street. The streets of Rome were narrow, not alleys, actual streets, the primary routes through the city, but narrow by any standard that a modern city dweller would find comfortable. The major streets were perhaps 4 or 5 meters wide. The minor streets were less. And through these narrow streets passed the entire commercial and social life of a city of 1 million people, plus the animals and the carts and the waste and the vendors and the children and the politicians and the criminals and the philosophers and the priests. The Roman solution to the problem of wheeled traffic in a city with narrow streets was prohibit it during daylight hours. Julius Caesar had enacted an ordinance, later maintained by subsequent administrations, that banned wheeled vehicles from the streets of Rome during daylight hours, with exceptions for public works, ceremonial occasions, and the Vestal Virgins' carriages. This was a practical attempt to manage the chaos that would otherwise result from trying to move carts and wagons through streets already full of pedestrians. The practical consequence: all goods delivery happened at night. The carts that supplied the city's shops and markets with their goods, the grain, the oil, the wine, the fish, the building materials, the pottery, the endless variety of commercial goods that a city of 1 million people consumed, all of this moved through the streets of Rome at night, when the pedestrians were mostly asleep, which meant that the people who were trying to sleep were being woken by iron-rimmed wheels on stone pavement. All night. Juvenal, again, wrote specifically about the impossibility of sleeping in Rome due to the cart noise. He described the specific sound of a cartwheel going over a pothole at 2 in the morning, with the irritated accuracy of a man who had been lying awake counting carts for too long. This is ancient Rome's insomnia problem. A city of 1 million people, compressed into narrow streets, with all its commercial logistics happening at night because the days were reserved for pedestrians, producing a continuous nocturnal rumbling that prevented adequate sleep. The Romans were chronically tired. They dealt with this the way chronically tired people deal with things, by being slightly irritable and supplementing with extended afternoon naps when the worst of the cart traffic was over. Let me tell you about the food. Because the food of ancient Rome is one of the most interesting aspects of the civilization, and one that the average popular history of Rome consistently underemphasizes. Most Romans did not cook at home. This is the fact that changes how you understand everything else. The upper-class Roman households, the domus, the larger private homes of the wealthy, had kitchens, but these were a minority of the housing stock. The insulae apartments, where the majority of the city's population lived, typically had no cooking facilities. The fire risk in a multi-story timber building made open cooking fires in individual apartments catastrophically dangerous. So where did the food come from? The thermopolium. The thermopolium, the Roman fast food counter, was one of the defining features of Roman street culture. It was a shop with a stone counter that had large ceramic vessels sunk into it, kept warm from below by charcoal. Behind the counter, hot food, stews, porridges, sausages, whatever the specific establishment offered. A Roman worker going to lunch did not go home for lunch. They stopped at one of the hundreds of thermopolia that lined the streets and had whatever was in the pots. Pompeii, which was preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, has yielded extraordinary evidence about Roman daily food culture. The thermopolia of Pompeii have been excavated and analyzed, and the food residues in the ceramic vessels have been studied. The findings: duck, pork, beef, goat, fish, olives, various legumes, local wines. The specific menus of specific shops preserved in the volcanic ash. There were also bakeries, dozens of them in Pompeii alone. The bread produced by these bakeries, the specific round loaves, some of which were also preserved at Pompeii and can be seen in museums today, was a staple of the Roman diet. In taverns, the taverna was not simply a place for drinking, though drinking happened there. It was a place for eating, for socializing, for the specific ambient life of the Roman street that modern people might recognize as the neighborhood bar, the cafe, the combination of food and drink and company that is one of the baseline social technologies of urban life. Marcus eats his morning meal at the thermopolium 2 doors down from his insulae. He has been eating there for most of the past decade. The man who runs it, a freedman named Titus Statilius, knows what Marcus usually orders and has it ready most mornings when Marcus arrives. This is not a particularly intimate relationship. It is the specific familiarity of daily commercial interaction repeated hundreds of times, the specific way that the regular customer and the provider of daily necessities develop a working understanding of each other's preferences. The morning meal is a small bowl of porridge, pools, the Roman basic staple, made from emmer wheat or spelt, with a small cup of pasca, the Roman working-class drink of water and vinegar that sounds terrible and reportedly tasted better than it sounds. An olive or two if there are any ready. Perhaps a piece of bread. Marcus eats standing at the counter. He is in a hurry. He has a job to get to. Let me tell you about the job. Marcus works for a building contractor who operates in the Transtiberum, the district across the Tiber from the main city, which will eventually become what we call Trastevere. He is a skilled worker, a tector, a plasterer who applies the smooth finishing coats to interior walls, and who also does the more skilled decorative plaster work that wealthy clients request for their houses and baths. This is a good trade. Rome is always building. The wealthy of Rome rebuilt and renovated their homes with a frequency that kept the building trades employed continuously, and the specific skill of good decorative plaster work, the ability to produce smooth, level surfaces and the more elaborate painted and textured finishes that fashion demanded, was a skilled trade that earned a reasonable living. Marcus is not wealthy. He is comfortable by the standards of his class. the skilled working Romans who were neither enslaved nor wealthy, who owned their labor and earned enough to eat and house themselves and sometimes save something, and who constituted a significant portion of the city's working population. He is a member of a collegium, a voluntary association of workers in his trade, something between a professional association and a social club and a mutual aid organization. The collegium met regularly, had a common fund for members' funerals and for communal meals, and for the various social events that gave the organization its cohesion, and provided the specific social network that was the alternative to family for a man who had moved from his original neighborhood and whose family connections were limited. He is not a citizen in the full sense. His family's background is provincial, and the complex gradations of Roman legal status meant that his specific citizenship classification gave him certain rights and not others. He votes, theoretically. He has in practice voted perhaps 3 times in his life, each time with the vague sense that his specific vote was not the mechanism through which the outcome was determined. He thinks about this occasionally and then goes back to plastering. His relationship to the Roman political system is approximately the relationship of most people to political systems that are nominally democratic but actually managed by a different class. He is aware of it. He occasionally interacts with it at its margins, and most of his actual daily decisions are made in a context in which it is largely irrelevant. He picks up his tools. He heads for the bridge. Let me take you away from Marcus for a moment. Let me take you to someone who experiences the same city completely differently. Her name is Lydia. She is 35 years old. She is a freedwoman formerly enslaved, manumitted by her previous owner approximately 8 years ago, who operates a small textile workshop in the area near the Circus Maximus. The workshop employs 3 other workers, 2 of whom are enslaved and 1 of whom is a hired freewoman. Lydia produces cloth and finished garments for a middling clientele. She is, by any reasonable assessment, a successful small businesswoman in one of the most competitive commercial environments in the ancient world. She is also navigating a legal and social landscape that is considerably more complex than Marcus's. A freedwoman in Roman society occupied a specific position, more than the enslaved, less than the freeborn. Her former owner retained specific legal rights over her, including a claim on some of her time and labor and on a portion of her estate at death. She could own property and conduct business, but her legal autonomy was not complete. She managed within this. The specific combination of commercial intelligence and legal awareness that her situation required was exactly the kind of intelligence that her biography had developed. You do not spend the early decades of your life without freedom and emerge from that experience without having become very good at reading situations and managing within constraints. Her workshop was profitable. She was building a small reserve of savings. She had specific plans for those savings that she was not yet ready to make public. Lydia's morning started earlier than Marcus's. The textile work required careful preparation before the main working day, and she was at the workshop before the second hour to ensure that the day's work was organized and the materials were prepared. She ate from one of the street vendors near the workshop entrance, bread, and a cup of the very sweet Roman wine mixed with water that was the standard morning drink of people who were up early. She had opinions about Roman wine that she kept mostly to herself. She organized her workers. The day's production schedule was in her head, as it always was. She set them to work. Let me tell you about the baths. Because the Roman baths are one of the most extraordinary social institutions of the ancient world, and any account of daily Roman life that doesn't spend substantial time in the thermae is incomplete. The public baths of Rome were not primarily luxury facilities, though they were certainly that for the wealthy who used the finest establishments. They were civic infrastructure. In a city where most apartments had no bathing facilities, just as they had no kitchens, The public baths were where the Roman working population went to bathe, to socialize, to exercise, to gossip, to conduct business, and to spend their leisure time. The typical entry fee to a public bath was minimal, affordable to most working Romans. Some emperors during their tenure made entry free to increase their popularity with the public. The layout of a Roman bath complex followed a standard sequence. The apoditerium, the changing room where you deposited your clothes and hoped they would still be there when you came back. Theft in the changing rooms was documented. The frigidarium, the cold pool, the tepidarium, the warm room, and the caldarium, the hot room, heated by the hypocaust system of underfloor heating. Some complexes had a gymnasium for exercise, a paelstra, outdoor space, libraries, gardens. The baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the baths of Trajan. The largest Roman bath complexes could accommodate thousands of people simultaneously, making them among the largest public gathering spaces in the ancient world. In these spaces, the specific social mixing that Rome's class structure elsewhere maintained was at least partially suspended. The senator and the tradesman used the same caldarium, the same pools, the same changing rooms. The baths were one of the few spaces in Roman social life where the physical hierarchy of the street was replaced by the more immediate hierarchy of who was talking to whom. Marcus goes to the baths in the late afternoon, after work. He has a favorite establishment near the Tiber, modest, not one of the great imperial complexes, but clean and well-managed, and with a reliable hot room and a caldarium attendant who knew when to add more wood to the furnace. He spends approximately an hour there. He is scraped with the strigil, the curved metal tool used instead of soap to clean the skin, drawing off the oil and sweat and dirt, by one of the bath attendants, which is one of the specific physical pleasures of the Roman bathing experience. He talks with the men in the changing room about the fire across the street, which they have all heard about, and about the building's owner, about whom they share specific opinions. He is arm when he leaves. He is clean. He feels, in the specific way of people who have performed the daily ritual of cleaning after physical work, like himself again. Let me tell you about the smell. Because this is the question everyone asks about ancient Rome when they think about it honestly, and it deserves an honest answer. Ancient Rome smelled of fish. Not primarily or exclusively. The city smelled of many things. But the fish market, the garum production, the fish in the streets, the fish being transported, the fish being cooked, the fish that was everywhere because fish was the cheapest and most widely consumed protein in a city of 1 million people, contributed a specific ambient note to the city's air that multiple ancient sources mention with varying degrees of resignation. Garum deserves special mention. Garum was Rome's ubiquitous condiment, a fermented fish sauce produced by packing fish, usually small whole fish or fish innards, in salt, and allowing them to ferment and liquefy over months. The result was an intensely flavored, strongly smelling liquid that Romans used the way modern cooking uses salt, on almost everything. The garum production facilities were not located in the city center precisely, because the fermentation smell was overpowering. They were typically in coastal towns or in designated production areas. The amphora of garum that circulated through Rome's shops and kitchens, the garum that went into the pots at the thermopolia, was the specific smell that characterized Roman cooking from the outside. Alongside the garum, the smoke of the cooking fires and lamps and braziers, the animal smell of the horses and mules and oxen that moved through the streets despite the cart restrictions, the smell of the fulleries, the laundries that processed wool using urine, for which purpose they collected urine from the public through vessels placed on street corners, the smell of the waste disposal, which was inconsistent across the city's different areas, and the smell of 1 million people going about their daily lives. And through all of it, the smell of the baths, the specific steam and marble smell of the thermi that was one of Rome's distinctive olfactory signatures, if you were near one. Marcus has lived in this smell his whole life. He does not notice it except when he has been away from the city, on a job outside the walls, in the country air of a wealthy client's country estate, and then returns. On those returns, in the first hour back in the city, the smell is present and specific before it becomes the baseline again. He likes the smell of the country. He also likes coming back. Let me take you to the Forum. Because the Forum Romanum was the center of Roman civic life, not a government building but a public space, the specific outdoor gathering place where commercial, legal, political, and social life intersected in a way that modern cities distribute across many separate spaces. The Forum in 60 AD was surrounded by temples and law courts and administrative buildings, and the speaker's platform, the rostra, from which politicians and orators addressed crowds. It was also, on any given day, full of merchants conducting business, lawyers and clients consulting before court appearances, money changers, snack vendors, people reading the posted public notices, people arguing about politics, people looking for work, people watching other people argue. The Forum was the city in miniature. Everyone passed through it eventually. The senator on his way to a political meeting, and the freedwoman on her way to negotiate a business contract, and the tourist from Alexandria seeing the capital for the first time, and the boy picking pockets in the crowd, all of them in the same space, at the same time. One of the things that made the Forum genuinely extraordinary, and that is easy to miss when you look at the archaeological remains, which are extensive ruins on a hillside, rather than anything that gives you the experience of the space at the height of the empire, is the acoustic environment. The Forum was full of voices, not just speakers on the rostra. The ambient voice level of a large crowd in an enclosed stone space was something that multiple ancient authors describe with the specific quality of urban sound that we recognize as the characteristic noise of dense public space. The basilicas that flanked the Forum, the large covered public halls used for law courts and business, added their own acoustic environments, the specific echo of large stone interiors full of arguing lawyers. Marcus passes through the Forum occasionally when his work takes him to clients on the Palatine Hill above it. He is not particularly interested in it as a civic space. He is aware of what happens there in the way that you are aware of the major institutions of your city. You know they exist. You have opinions about them. You do not spend time in them unless necessary. The trial T. Hat is happening in the Basilica on the left side of the Forum, a property dispute between two wealthy families that has been going on for approximately a year, and that everyone in the city seems to have heard something about. Marcus knows the general outlines of, and has no specific opinion on. He is not the plaintiff. He is not the defendant. He is a plasterer on his way to a job on the Palatine. The Forum is between him and the job. He walks through it. He does not stop. Let me now tell you about the social life. Because the social life of ancient Rome was one of the most sophisticated and most documented aspects of the civilization, and it existed in forms that are partly recognizable and partly entirely alien. The client-patron relationship was one of the fundamental organizing structures of Roman society. In the morning, the first 2 or 3 hours of the day, a wealthy man's home would be open to receive his clients, the people of lower status who had attached themselves to his household as social and economic dependents in exchange for his advocacy and occasional material support. The salutatio, the morning greeting visit, was a formal ritual. The clients came, waited in the atrium in order of their status, were received by the patron, exchanged pleasantries or brief substantive discussion, received whatever the patron's steward handed out, often the sportula, a basket of food or sometimes a sum of money that formalized the relationship's material dimension, and left. Marcus has a patron. Everyone in Rome had a patron, or aspired to one, or operated within a network of these relationships that distributed both obligation and benefit. His specific patron is a man named Gaius Petronius, not the famous Petronius, the author of the Satyricon, though they are contemporaries, but a moderately wealthy merchant who has taken an interest in the building trades and whose household occasionally uses Marcus's plastering services, and who in return has provided recommendations, has twice intervened with a client who was slow to pay, and who Marcus can theoretically call upon in a genuine crisis. Marcus attends the salutatio approximately once a week. He stands in the atrium. He waits his turn. He exchanges the specific pleasantries of the relationship. He receives the sportula. He leaves. The relationship is genuine in the sense that both parties perform it and maintain it. It is also transactional in the most explicit possible way. This was not considered a contradiction in Roman culture. Let me tell you about the emperor. Because Nero is somewhere in this city, and the city's relationship with its emperor is part of the texture of the daily life. Nero, in 60 AD, is 23 years old and has been emperor for 6 years. He is the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He is genuinely interested in music and theater and Greek culture, which his Roman contemporaries find undignified in ways that the historical record preserves with some venom. He has also, in the early part of his reign, been guided by the philosopher Seneca and the commander Burrus in ways that made the actual governance relatively competent. The relationship between the emperor and the million-person city was not the relationship between a leader and his public in any modern democratic sense. The emperor governed. The Senate pretended to govern while actually managing the ceremonial and advisory dimensions of governance. The people watched and occasionally made their opinions known through the specific forms available to them. The crowds at the theater, the cheering or silence at the games, the anonymous abuse that could appear on walls, the rare and dangerous moments of popular unrest. The bread and circuses, panem et circenses, formula that Juvenal would later characterize was a genuine feature of the relationship. Free grain was distributed to the Roman citizen population from the state grain supply. The games, the gladiatorial contests, the chariot racing, the theatrical performances were provided as public entertainment at public expense. Nero, in particular, was enthusiastic about the theatrical entertainments and occasionally performed in them, which generated significant scandal. An emperor performing on stage, where professional entertainers who were socially infames like gladiators did their work, was considered deeply inappropriate. Nero did it anyway. The population's reaction was mixed. Some people found it charming. Some people found it disturbing. Most people had the specific relationship with the emperor that most people have with distant, powerful figures. They were aware of what was happening, they had opinions about it, and their daily lives were largely unaffected by the specific personality of the person at the top. The fire of 64 AD, which will happen 4 years after the morning we are spending with Marcus, will be the event that makes Nero genuinely famous and genuinely hated, but that is 4 years away. For now, Nero is performing in a theater somewhere in the city, and the Senate is appalled, and most of the city's million people are going about their daily business with roughly the attention to the emperor's theatrical hobby that most people pay to the personal interests of their national leaders. Let me tell you about the religion. Because Roman religion was one of the most densely present features of the daily life, and it looked completely different from what the word religion might suggest to a modern person. There were temples everywhere. Not one temple, not a few important temples, dozens of temples, hundreds of shrines, altars on street corners, household shrines in the private home. The city was saturated with sacred spaces. The Roman relationship with these sacred spaces was not the once weekly, organized congregation relationship of most modern Western religions. It was more continuous and more casual. You might stop at a shrine on your way to work to make a brief offering. You might say a word to the Lares, the household gods, as you left the house in the morning. You might visit a temple to make a vow when something important was at stake, or to give thanks afterward if it had gone well. The Roman religion was transactional in a specific sense that modern Western religions usually are not. The relationship with the gods was an exchange. You offered something, sacrifice, prayer, dedication, the performance of a vow, and the gods were expected to provide something in return. This was not considered impious. It was the correct understanding of how the divine world worked. The specific gods you paid most attention to depended on your circumstances. Jupiter and Juno and Minerva were the great civic gods. Mercury was the patron of commerce and travelers, and any merchant would have paid attention to Mercury. For the working trades, there were specific patron deities: Vulcan for the metal workers, Ceres for the grain dependent. For health, there was Asclepius. For love, there was Venus. Marcus has a small household shrine in his apartment, a niche in the wall with a small terracotta figure of the Lares of the household, the protective spirits of the home. Every morning when he leaves, he says a brief, non-ceremonial acknowledgement to them. This is not a deep religious practice. It is the specific habituation of a culture saturated with sacred presence. He does it the way he checks the window to assess the weather, automatically, briefly, with the specific low-level attention of someone performing a practice so embedded in daily life that it has stopped requiring conscious decision. He also, twice a year, visits the Temple of Mercury with a small offering. He has a vague and nonspecific sense that this relationship with Mercury has been useful. He does not analyze this. He makes the offering. Let me tell you about the evening. Because the evening in Rome was the social peak of the Roman day, the time when the work was done and the baths had been visited, and the day's business was concluded, and the Romans gathered for the activities that constituted their leisure. The dinner, the cena, was the main meal of the Roman day. For the wealthy, it was an elaborate affair: multiple courses, wine, guests, entertainment, the specific performance of Roman hospitality that was also the performance of Roman social status. For the working population, it was simpler: more thermopolium food, or simple home preparation if you had the equipment, or participation in the various communal eating arrangements that collegium membership and neighborhood associations provided. Marcus's evening meal is at the tavern near his insulae that he goes to most evenings when the day's work allows it. The tavern is run by a woman named Gaia, who is approximately 50, and who has run the place for 20 years, and who has the specific authority of someone who has been in the same physical space, dealing with the same population for 20 years. She knows everyone. She has opinions about everything. She moderates the specific arguments that happen in her tavern: the property dispute on the Caelian Hill, the quality of the current chariot racing teams at the Circus Maximus, the appropriate response to the landlord who was not feeling generous about the third-floor fire, with the patient firmness of someone who has heard every version of every argument and whose primary interest is that the evening should proceed without the furniture being damaged. Marcus eats. He drinks the relatively cheap wine that Gaia serves. He talks with the men he talks with most evenings: a colleague from the building trades, a grain merchant who has the room next door at the insulae, an older man who seems to have retired from something and who does not explain what about the fire, about the chariot races, about whether the weather is going to turn cold earlier than usual. Year. The evening continues. The city is loud outside the tavern, as it always is. At some point Marcus walks home. He climbs 4 flights of stairs. He lights his lamp. He reads for a while. He is minimally literate, enough to read simple texts slowly, which is not unusual for his class but is not universal either. He puts out the lamp. He goes to sleep to the sound of the cart traffic beginning its night rounds. He is woken twice by particularly loud wheels on particularly significant potholes. He sleeps again. He wakes before dawn. He looks out the window. The building across the street, is no longer on fire. He goes to get his morning porridge. He is 29 years old. He has lived in this city his whole life. He will live in it for another 31 years. He does not know this. He picks up his tools. He goes to work. Let me now take you away from Marcus and give you a different kind of Roman life. Let me give you Rufus. Rufus is 13 years old. He is freeborn but poor. His father was a freed slave who died when Rufus was 8. His mother works in a foolery, and Rufus is currently in the specific situation of an adolescent boy in a city of 1 million people who needs to earn money and has not yet found a stable way to do so. He runs errands. This sounds modest. In the specific geography and social organization of ancient Rome, it was actually a viable economic strategy. The city's dense population, the absence of any communication technology beyond the human messenger, the specific needs of people who required things sent, fetched, or carried, all of this created a constant demand for the services of a quick and reliable message carrier and errand runner. Rufus knew the city's streets the way a child who has grown up in them and been running through them since he could run knows streets. Not by map or by street name, but by the specific texture of the routes, the shortcuts through the alleys, the specific corners where specific things were always happening. He had a regular set of clients. Gaia, the tavern keeper, sent him for wine deliveries occasionally. A lawyer with an office near the Forum used him for document delivery. Several households used him for various odd errands. He was fast, reliable, and knew when to ask no questions. These qualities were worth something in the city. He ate well enough. He slept in the room he shared with his mother in an insulae in the Subura, the dense, noisy, somewhat dangerous district between the Esquiline and Quirinal hills that was the most concentrated working-class neighborhood in the city. The Subura was where the cheapest housing was, where the most people were compressed into the most space, where the noise was loudest and the smell was strongest and the fire hazard was most acute. Rufus navigated its streets with the practiced ease of someone who had never known a quieter world. He did not find the Subura frightening. It was simply the city. Let me tell you about the children. Because children in ancient Rome existed in a world that is partly recognizable and partly alien. The mortality rate for children in the ancient world was high by any modern standard. The specific data is difficult to establish precisely because the recording of births and deaths was inconsistent, but demographic historians estimate that somewhere between 20 and 30% of children in the Roman Empire died before reaching their 5th birthday. The parents of ancient Rome lived with this knowledge. The specific practices of Roman child-rearing reflect it. The dies lustricus, the naming day, held on the 8th day for a girl and the 9th for a boy, was the occasion when the child was formally admitted to the family. Before this date, the child's survival was uncertain enough that the full social recognition was withheld. This was not coldness. It was the specific adaptation of a culture to the reality of infant mortality. After the dies lustricus, the child was a person. The child wore the bulla, a protective amulet that was the specific marker of freeborn childhood, and was understood to be under the protection of the household gods and the family. The children of working-class Rome were integrated into the household economy from early ages, like the children of most pre-industrial societies. Not in the factory labor sense, but in the specific apprenticeship sense of learning the work that would eventually be their work, by doing it alongside the adults. Rufus, at 13, is already doing the work of an adult errand runner. He is 13. He is also running through the streets of Rome with his routes memorized, and his reputation for reliability building, and his specific assessment of which clients pay promptly, and which ones require chasing. He is, in the way that necessity accelerates, already most of the way to the adult he will eventually be. Let me give you the specific texture of the morning. Mark it. because the Roman morning market was one of the great sensory events of the ancient world, and it deserves to be rendered fully. The market began before dawn. Not the permanent shops, those opened with the day, but the informal street market, the vendors who claimed spaces in the squares and the wider street intersections, began setting up in the last hours of the night, so that by the time the city was fully awake, there was a functioning commercial landscape already in place. The fish sellers were there first. The fish came from the Tiber and from the Ostian fishing grounds, and from the preserved fish that had traveled from the coasts, the dried and salted varieties that could travel further. It arrived in the early morning because fresh fish does not keep, and the market for it was the morning. The smell was specific and not subtle. Next, the bread. The bakeries had been running through the night. The Roman bread sellers began their ovens in the dark and had fresh loaves available at the market at dawn. The smell of fresh bread in a street market is, across all cultures and all historical periods, one of the most universally appealing smells available to human beings. In the specific context of the Roman morning market, it mixed with the fish smell in a way that produced something specific and urban and Roman. The vegetable sellers, greens, onions, garlic, whatever the season provided, and the supply chains from the Italian countryside and the urban kitchen gardens had produced. The olive oil vendors with their amphorae. The wine sellers with their smaller vessels. The sausage makers. The fruit vendors. The cheese sellers. The specific noise of this market. Voices in Latin and Greek and various other languages, because Rome was a city of immigrants and visitors from every corner of the empire. The sounds of negotiation, which in Roman market culture was expected rather than exceptional. The sounds of animals, the occasional pig being transported, the mule standing at the corner with its load, the sound of the vendors calling their goods. Marcus moves through this market on his way to the building site. He does not stop. He knows what he wants and where to get it. He has been buying his morning meal for 20 years. The market is background. It is also, in the specific way that the places you walk through every day become part of you, the particular Rome he carries in his body. Let me close with the city at dusk. Because the city changes at dusk in the specific way that Rome, more than almost any other ancient city, was documented as changing. The light in Rome at dusk, in the years before electric lighting, in the years when the only outdoor lights were the oil lamps hung outside shops and taverns and homes, and in the niches of shrines, had a specific quality that the rich documentation of Roman literature preserves. The shops began closing, the awnings were taken in, the commercial activity of the day wound down, replaced by the more social activity of the evening. The taverns filled. The streets acquired a different kind of crowd, the evening crowd, the people coming out for dinner and company rather than for commerce. The oil lamps came on, one by one. The specific warm orange of oil lamp light on the plaster of the Roman insulae, the shadows it cast in the narrow streets, the pools of light around doorways and the darkness between them. This was the Rome that ended the working day. The poor were careful with their lamps, because oil was not cheap and the risk of fire was not theoretical. The wealthy used more lamps and had more light, and the specific distribution of light in Rome's streets was therefore also a map of its economic geography. The city was noisier at night than in the day. The carts, as we have discussed, and the specific nocturnal activity of a city that did not sleep cleanly. And through it all, the smell, the garum and the fish and the bread and the lamp oil and the baths and the people and the river, which you could smell from most of the city on certain wind directions, the specific green-brown smell of the Tiber carrying its cargo of the city's output toward the sea. This was Rome, not the marble Rome of the museums. The smelly, noisy, fire-prone, thousand-year Rome of the people who lived in it. Marcus climbs his 4 flights. He lights his lamp. He looks out the window at the building across the street. The third floor is dark, where it was not dark yesterday. The city is loud below. The Tiber is somewhere in the direction the wind is blowing from. He is home. Sleep now. The cart wheels are starting. The fire is not a metaphor. The fish market opens in 4 hours. Good night. Thank you for spending tonight in Rome. Subscribe if Dull Tales is your evening company. Leave a comment, tell me if you've been to Rome, what it smelled like in August, whether you found a thermopolium in Pompeii and thought about who sent. Ood at that counter. Next time, the Black Plague from the inside, not the statistics, the specific daily experience of a city that is dying and the people who are keeping it going anyway. But tonight, Marcus, Lydia, Rufus, Gaia, the fish market and the baths and the apartment building definitely on fire. The noisy, smelly, magnificent ordinary Rome. Good night. Let me give you the legal system. Because Roman law was one of the civilization's most significant contributions to the world, and it is also, in its daily operation, one of the more fascinating aspects of the daily life. The Romans were extraordinarily litigious. This was not considered a character flaw. It was considered an appropriate engagement with the civic system. The courts were one of the public entertainments of Rome, in a specific sense. Court proceedings were public, were conducted in the basilicas or in the open forum, and were attended by crowds who came to hear the famous orators. The Roman court system was not simple. There were different courts for different kinds of cases, different procedures for different types of plaintiff, complex rules about who could represent whom and on what terms. The legal profession, the advocates, was one of the more prestigious white-collar occupations in Roman society. Men who became famous advocates, like Cicero a century earlier, achieved a kind of celebrity that made their court appearances events. The specific legal drama that most affected the daily life of Marcus and Lydia and Rufus was not the grand senatorial trial or the famous constitutional case. It was the small claims equivalent, the dispute with a landlord over the terms of the apartment lease, the argument with a client who hadn't paid for the plastering work, the complaint about the foolery down the street that was disposing of its waste in a way that damaged the neighboring property. The Roman legal system had mechanisms for all of these, and people used them, with the same litigious enthusiasm that the historical record documents from top to bottom of the social structure. Lydia has used the courts twice. Once to pursue a client who had refused to pay for a textile order, claiming the goods were defective. The case was decided in her favor, though collecting the payment required subsequent enforcement that she found time-consuming. Once to defend herself against a claim from her former owner that she owed him a portion of her business's profits beyond what their manumission agreement specified. This case was decided in her favor as well, after several months, and the assistance of a lawyer whose fee was significant. She now has a specific opinion about the Roman legal system. It works, she would say. It just takes longer and costs more than the amount at issue in about a third of the cases. This is an accurate assessment that would apply to legal systems in many different historical periods. Let me tell you about the slaves. Because Rome was a slave society, and any account of Roman daily life that doesn't address slavery is an account of Roman daily life that is avoiding the thing that makes the most difference to understanding it. In a city of approximately 1 million people, roughly a quarter to a third were enslaved. The specific numbers are debated, but slavery was not a marginal feature of Roman society. It was a structural foundation. The enslaved people of Rome performed every category of work: domestic service, skilled craft production, commercial management, agricultural labor, mining, gladiatorial fighting, teaching, administrative management. Some enslaved people in wealthy households occupied positions of significant responsibility. The tutor, the manager of the estate, the skilled craftsmen whose work was sold under the owner's name. Some were condemned to the mines, where the life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. The diversity of enslaved experience was enormous. This diversity did not mean that slavery was not what it was. An enslaved person in a comfortable household position was still property, still without legal personhood, still subject to their owner's authority in ways that had no equivalent in the legal status of the free poor. The specific horror of slavery is not primarily about material conditions. It is about the absence of self-determination, the fact of being owned. The Roman system of manumission, the formal freeing of enslaved people, was more widespread than in many other ancient slave systems. Roman owners freed their enslaved people for various reasons: reward for service, the specific legal and social incentive structure that made some manumissions advantageous to the owner, simple humanity. But manumission required the owner's consent and was always a gift rather than a right. Lydia was one of these freed people. Her experience of slavery is not something she speaks about routinely. It was 23 years of her life, from childhood until she was in her 30s, and it ended eventually, and she built what she built after. She does not pretend that what she built after constitutes a settlement of what those 23 years cost. She does not have the language for what those 23 years cost, and if she did, she would not use it in the shop where the business is. She manages the workshop. She works. She is very good at what she does. Let me give you the water. Because the Roman aqueduct system was one of the engineering achievements of the ancient world, and the daily consequence of that achievement, the specific presence of running water in a city of 1 million people, shaped the daily life in ways that are difficult to overstate. 11 major aqueducts supplied Rome with water by the 1st century AD. The total volume delivered was enormous. Modern estimates suggest something like 1 million cubic meters per day, which works out to approximately 1,000 liters per person. This is significantly more than the daily per capita water consumption of many modern cities. The water ran continuously. It ran into the public fountains that were the primary water access point for the apartment-dwelling population. It ran into the baths, whose operations depended entirely on the constant water supply. It ran into the private houses of the wealthy, who had private water connections. It ran into the fountains and pools of the public spaces. The fountains were constant. The sound of running water was one of the ambient sounds of Rome, not something you would particularly notice, because it was always there, but something that contributed to the specific acoustic texture of the city's public spaces. Marcus fills his water vessel at the fountain on the corner each morning. This is a routine act, the same as the morning porridge at the thermopolium, something he has done thousands of times, something that requires no thought. The water is cold and clean. The aqueduct that supplies this fountain draws from springs in the hills outside the city. The specific quality of this water, cold, mineral, spring-sourced, is better than the water in most places in the world without plumbing. Rome had better water than most modern cities in the developing world. In 60 AD, this is one of the more striking technological facts of Roman civilization. The water supply was genuinely excellent, and the excellence of the water supply was the result of engineering investment and maintenance over several centuries. The lead pipes that the water ran through are a separate problem. We know now that lead leaches into water and causes cognitive effects. The Romans did not know this, though there are ancient sources that remark on the taste difference between water from lead pipes and water from ceramic pipes. The health consequences of the lead infrastructure are debated by historians. The population's exposure was not constant or universal, and the flowing nature of the aqueduct water meant less lead pickup than standing water in lead vessels would produce. The conversation about Roman lead exposure continues in academic literature. In the meantime, the water was abundant, it was cold, it ran from the fountain on Marcus's corner every morning. He fills his vessel. He carries it up 4 flights. He has water for the day. Let me give you the games. Because the entertainment culture of ancient Rome was an important feature of daily life and deserves more than a mention. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus were probably the most popular entertainment in the city. The Circus Maximus, which could accommodate approximately 250,000 spectators, was the largest public gathering space in the ancient world. On race days, it was full. The chariot racing teams, the blues, the greens, the reds, the whites, had fan followings that were fanatical in ways that modern sports fans would recognize immediately. People identified with their team with the same totality that modern fans identify with football clubs. The specific partisan intensity of the chariot racing fandom was documented by multiple ancient sources as extending well beyond mere sporting preference into the territory of civic identity. Riots happened. Not rarely, riots between factions of chariot racing fans were a documented feature of late Roman and Byzantine civic life, and while they were less common in the 1st century AD than in the later periods, the intensity of the fandom was already present. Marcus is a blues supporter. He became a blues supporter because his father was a blues supporter. He goes to the races approximately twice a month when he can afford the time. The Circus Maximus is free. The emperor provides the races as a public gift, but the time cost of attending a full day of races is the opportunity cost of a day's work. He has calculated this and decided twice a month is approximately right. He also goes to the gladiatorial games at the amphitheater when there are games. We covered this world in the Gladiator episode, which gives you the full texture of that specific institution. What I will add here, in the context of the daily Roman life, is this. The games and the races were not separately organized entertainment events that happened to a passive population. They were the shared public events around which the city organized significant portions of its social calendar, its conversation, and its identity. What did Romans talk about when they weren't talking about the courts? The races, the games, the specific performance of the blues driver who had won last week and whose form was expected to continue. Let me give you the specific social world of Gaia's tavern. Because the tavern, not as a concept, but as this specific place, with this specific owner and this specific regular clientele, was the social center of a particular neighborhood of Rome, in the way that specific places have always been the social centers of specific neighborhoods. Gaia is a widow. Her husband Lucius ran the tavern until he died 12 years ago of a chest infection, and Gaia took it over and has been running it since. The transition was not smooth. There were people who assumed she would sell it or hand it to a male relative, and she did neither, and the people who made this assumption had to readjust. Gaia's tavern is not the most elegant establishment in the neighborhood. The wine is adequate, not excellent. The food is simple. The furniture has been repaired more times than it is possible to count. But the place is clean. Gaia maintains specific standards about fighting and about running up debts that she enforces with the patient effectiveness of 20 years of practice. And the regulars who come there, the same people, largely, most evenings, have developed the specific communal existence of people who have been in the same social space regularly for years. They know each other's business. Not always by asking, by proximity, by observation, by the specific information that circulates in a small social world. Gaia knows that Marcus's patron has reduced his financial support because of the business slowdown that followed the recent flooding near the Tiber. She knows this because Marcus mentioned it to the grain merchant, and the grain merchant mentioned it in passing to Gaia, and Gaia filed it as information relevant to whether Marcus's tab can safely be extended. She has not extended the tab. She has charged a little less for the wine this week. She has not explained this. Marcus has not asked. Both of them understand the transaction perfectly. This is community, in the specific form that community takes in the daily commercial life of a working-class neighborhood in a city of 1 million people. Let me give you one more character. Let me give you Aelia. Aelia is 48 years old. She is freeborn, the daughter of a potter who died leaving a modest workshop to her and her 2 brothers who have since moved elsewhere, leaving the workshop to Aelia's management. She makes pots. Not the elaborate decorated pottery of the wealthy market. She makes the utilitarian pottery that everyone in Rome needed constantly. Storage vessels, cooking pots, the specific ceramic containers that the Roman daily life depended on for everything from oil to grain to water to garum. Her pottery is not art. It is infrastructure. She has been making pots since she was 8 years old. She knows clay the way merge new felt, in the hands, in the body, the knowledge too specific and too continuous to be fully articulated. Her kiln fires once a week, on a specific day, in an alley arrangement that the neighborhood has understood for 30 years, with the specific smoke management that the neighbors have grown to accept in exchange for the specific community benefits that having Aelia available for their pottery needs provides. The fire of the kiln once a week. The smoke. The smell of fired clay that anyone who has ever been near a working pottery would recognize. This is also Rome. The utilitarian, unglamorous essential Rome that made the glamorous Rome possible. Without the people who made the pots, the garum had nowhere to sit, and the oil had nowhere to be stored, and the grain had nowhere to be measured. Aelia makes the pots. She has been making them for 40 years. She will make them for approximately 15 more. She is good at it. She is, by the specific standards that matter in the daily operation of a working-class neighborhood in the largest city in the ancient world, important. Now let me bring you back to the present. From the fire across the street and the morning porridge, and the 4 flights of stairs, and the baths in Gaia's tavern and the fish market, and the cart wheels on the cobblestones at midnight. You have been in the Rome that nobody films. Not the marble steps of the Senate, or the triumph of the legions, or the famous names. The Rome of Marcus and Lydia and Rufus and Gaia and Aelia. The Rome that woke up before dawn and went to get its morning porridge and climbed its stairs and went to the baths and came home and drank its wine and went asleep to the sound of the carts. This Rome lasted approximately 1,000 years, in various configurations. The marble Rome is what we visit when we go to the ruins. The daily life Rome is what most of the 1 million people who lived there actually inhabited. They were dirty and noisy and perpetually slightly on fire, and they smelled of fish and lamp oil, and they had an extraordinarily good water supply, and they went to the baths every day, and they followed the chariot races with a passion that survived 15 centuries and became the passion of modern sports fans. They were fully human. They were fully alive. They were fully there. Sleep now. The cart wheels are starting outside. The fish market opens at dawn. The lamp is out. Good night. Let me give you more of the texture. Let me give you the street food in more detail. Because the Roman street food culture was so developed and so specific and so ahead of its time that it deserves the close attention. The thermopolium was everywhere. In Pompeii, the best preserved snapshot we have of a Roman commercial street, archaeologists have found approximately 80 thermopolia on the city's excavated streets. For a city of perhaps 11,000 to 20,000 people in Pompeii, that is an extraordinary density. Rome, with its 1 million people, would have had proportionally more. The specific food available at a Roman thermopolium varied by establishment. The menus were not written down in a fixed form for most of them. You asked what was in the pots and you chose. The contents of the pots varied by season, by what was available at the market that morning, by the specific specialization of the establishment. Some thermopolia were essentially soup vendors, some were more varied, some had wine available in addition to food, some had a few seats, small tables, benches, where you could sit rather than standing at the counter. The Roman equivalent of the restaurant review existed. Martial, the poet, included in his epigrams specific references to specific establishments and their quality. Not formal reviews, but the specific social commentary on food quality that exists in every culture with sufficient commercial food provision. The best-known street food reference in Roman literature might be Horace's description of his shopping. I stroll about, inquiring first the price of greens and flour, then I wander through the lying circus in the evenings, stand about the fortune-tellers. From there, I return home to my dish of leeks, legumes, and pancakes. Pancakes. Horace ate pancakes in the 1st century BC. The specific continuity of some human foods across all the time is occasionally startling. Let me tell you about the writing on the walls. Because the Roman street was a written environment in ways that most pre-modern cities were not, and the writing on the walls of Roman cities, the graffiti that survives from Pompeii and other preserved sites, is one of the most direct windows into the Roman popular mind. The graffiti of Pompeii runs to approximately 11,000 documented examples. They range from the mundane to the obscene, to the political, to the affectionate, to the specifically documented human experiences of boredom and lust and loneliness that are the conditions of spending time in public spaces. There are election notices, formal endorsements of candidates for municipal office, apparently painted by hired sign writers which cover entire walls. There are gladiator rankings and fight results. There are love declarations. There are announcements of rental properties and lost objects. There are philosophical statements. There are insults. There are declarations of pride or shame about specific bodily functions. And there are simple names. People who carved or painted their names on the wall because they wanted to mark that they had been there. I was here. This is perhaps the most human impulse in the archaeological record, the desire to mark one's presence, to say, I existed in this specific place at this specific time. People still write their names on walls. The names change. The impulse doesn't. In this Rome of 60 AD that we have been inhabiting tonight, the walls of the street Marcus walks through every morning are covered in this writing. The election notices from the most recent municipal elections. An advertisement for a rooms-to-let property 2 streets over. Someone's declaration of affection for a person they identify by initials. A rendering of a gladiator that suggests its creator had some drawing skill. Several statements that are too rude to reproduce, but that Marcus has read and found funny or not, depending on the day. He has added nothing to Th. E. Wall himself. He is not a wall writer. He has opinions about wall writers that he keeps to himself. Let me tell you about the Roman concept of time. Because the Roman day was organized differently from the modern day, and the difference in how time was organized affected the daily rhythm in ways that matter for understanding the life. The Roman day was divided into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night. This seems straightforward, but the crucial detail is that the length of the hour changed with the seasons. In summer, a Roman daylight hour was longer than an equinox hour. In winter, a Roman daylight hour was shorter. The hours were equal divisions of the available daylight, not fixed absolute units. This meant that the duration of activities measured in Roman hours varied by season. An hour of work in summer lasted longer than an hour of work in winter. The calendar and the clock were seasonal instruments rather than absolute ones. The most important practical consequence. The 4th hour in summer was a different absolute time from the 4th hour in winter, even though both referred to the same fraction of the available daylight. Romans managed this with sundials, which naturally produced this seasonal variation, and with water clocks for indoor or nighttime timekeeping. The relationship to time that this produced was different from the modern relationship. Time was less absolute, more ecological. You organized your day around the position of the sun rather than around a fixed grid of hours. This is not better or worse than the modern fixed-hour system. It is adapted to a different technology and a different economic context. But it means that when Marcus tells someone he will meet them at the 5th hour, what that means in absolute terms is seasonal, and both parties understand this. Let me tell you about the Roman relationship with death. Because death in ancient Rome was present in ways that modern Western culture manages to be largely invisible, and the specific Roman practices around death shaped the daily experience. The tombs were outside the city. Roman law prohibited burial inside the city limits, and the result was that the major roads leading into Rome were lined with tombs, the large elaborate monuments of wealthy families and the smaller, simpler markers of the less wealthy, stretching along the roads for miles. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, was the most famous of these tomb-lined roads. This meant that every Roman who traveled in or out of the city passed through a landscape of the dead. Not hidden, not in a dedicated cemetery park on the edge of town, along the road, part of the journey present. The Romans did not find this morbid. The tombs were often elaborately inscribed with the biography of the deceased, with instructions to the passerby, with the specific messages of people who understood that the only immortality available to them was being read by travelers on the road. The inscriptions sometimes speak directly. I was what you are. You will be what I am. A reminder, a connection, the specific Roman engagement with mortality that is simultaneously more present and less frightening than the modern management of death. Some tomb inscriptions are funny. There is a significant tradition of Roman funerary humor, the specific joke about mortality that says, I might be dead, but at least I'm out of debt, or, here I lie as I once lay on your couch, reader, but this is the last time. The Romans joked about death with a consistency and a lightness that is either admirable or inappropriate, depending on your perspective. Perhaps both. Let me give you the Subura, because the Subura deserves its own section. The Subura was the densest, noisiest, most chaotic neighborhood in Rome, the area between the Esquiline and Quirinal hills, where the poorest of the city's poor lived in the most compressed conditions. It was also, by most accounts, the most alive neighborhood in the city, in the specific way that places where everything is happening simultaneously and nothing is organized, and the humanity is just spilling everywhere tend to be alive in a way that more organized places are not. The Subura had the best and worst of Rome simultaneously. The best, the food which was varied and cheap, the street markets that spilled into the alleyways, the specific density of human commercial activity in a small space. The worst, the crime which was documented as higher here than in other neighborhoods, the specific danger of the narrow, dark alleys at night, the fire hazard of the compressed timber construction. Juvenal wrote about it as a place of horror. He was probably not wrong, and also probably not entirely right. Juvenal was writing satire, which required exaggeration, and the Subura he described was the Subura of a specific point of view. Rufus, who lives there, has a different point of view. He has friends there, he knows the outs, he knows which tavern to avoid after the 3rd hour of the night, and which alleys are safe at midnight, and which are not. He knows the specific social geography of the Subura in the way that children who grow up in dense urban neighborhoods know their neighborhoods, by texture, by reputation, by the accumulated experience of moving through it daily. He does not love the Subura in a sentimental way. He is 13. But he is of it and from it, and it is his. Let me now truly close. You have been in Rome for a long time tonight. in the fire across the street, and the bucket brigade, and the morning porridge. In the forum where Marcus does not stop. In the baths where he sits in the hot room and feels like himself again. In Gaia's tavern, where the wine is adequate and the furniture has been repaired too many times. In the fish market at dawn. In Lydia's textile workshop, where she knows exactly what she is building and why. In Rufus's roots through the Subura. In Aelia's kiln once a week, the pottery that the city depended on. In the wall writing and the sundials and the cart wheels at midnight and the running water at the corner fountain. This was the Rome that most Romans inhabited. Not the Senate, not the legions, not the famous names. This, the ordinary, extraordinary daily life of a city that was the largest and most complex human settlement on Earth for approximately 5 centuries. And the people in it were tired from the cart noise and well-bathed from the thermi and arguing about the chariot races and negotiating with the landlord, who was not feeling generous and eating their morning porridge at the counter of the thermopolium, and climbing their 4 flights and blowing out their lamps and sleeping, when they could, through the rumble of commerce in the streets below. They were fully alive. They are still alive, in the sense that the civilization they inhabited is still the civilization we inherited, still the reference point we return to, still the source of the law and the city, and the specific form of organized urban life that most of the world now lives in. The Roman street is still the template for the modern street. The thermopolium is still the model for the fast food counter. The collegium is still the model for the professional association. The baths, the social, communal, daily bathing culture, we mostly abandoned, which is a loss, but some of the modern spa and wellness culture is trying to remember what we lost. Rome is not past. It is the grammar of the present. Sleep. The carts are rumbling. The fish market opens in 4 hours. Good night. Let me give you the doctors. Because medicine in ancient Rome was a specific and interesting world that shaped the daily experience in ways that matter. Rome had doctors, professional physicians, trained in the Hippocratic tradition that had developed in Greece and been elaborated and systematized by writers like Galen, who we met briefly in the Gladiator episode. The quality of Roman medicine varied enormously, from the skilled and genuinely effective physician who understood wounds and certain diseases and had real tools for dealing with them, to the quack selling remedies of no value in the street. The medical market in Rome was unregulated. Anyone could call themselves a doctor. The state had some interest in the quality of physicians, and emperors employed official physicians, but for most Romans the assessment of a doctor's quality was left to reputation and word of mouth. The specific services available from Roman medicine that were genuinely effective: surgery, for wounds and certain conditions, using techniques developed partly through the gladiatorial experience we discussed, setting broken bones, some herbal remedies with actual pharmaceutical activity, midwifery, which was practiced primarily by women, and which the historical record suggests was reasonably skilled. The specific services available from Roman medicine that were not effective: most of the treatments for internal diseases, which were based on the humoral framework that understood illness as imbalance of the 4 humors, and that prescribed treatments, bloodletting, purging, various dietary regimens, that were at best useless and at worst harmful. Marcus has visited a doctor twice in his adult life, both times for injuries: a cut on his arm from a plaster tool that became infected, and a sprained ankle from a fall at a work site. Both times the treatment was broadly appropriate, cleaning the wound and applying an herbal preparation for the arm, rest and elevation for the ankle. He has avoided the quacks who set up on street corners with their bottles of universal remedies. He is suspicious of all-purpose solutions. This is a reasonable position. Let me tell you about the education. Because literacy in ancient Rome was higher than in most pre-modern societies, and the specific educational system that produced Thai.'s literacy was interesting. Rome had schools, not universal state-funded schools in the modern sense, but private schools. The literator taught basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a family that wanted their child educated paid the literator's fee. Secondary education at the grammaticus level was available for those who could afford it and was focused on literature, rhetoric, and the specific skills of the educated Roman. The ability to speak well, to argue effectively, to engage with the classical texts. The literacy rate in Rome is estimated at somewhere between 20 and 40% of the adult population, which is high by ancient world standards. The specifically urban character of the city's population, the commercial economy that required literacy, the specific culture that valued written communication, all of these drove literacy higher than it would otherwise have been. Marcus is, as noted, minimally literate. He can read slowly. He can write his name and simple text. This puts him in the lower range of the literate population. Rufus cannot read. His mother is trying to arrange some instruction for him, because she has noticed that the people who can read seem to have more options than the people who cannot. This is an accurate observation. Lydia is more literate than Marcus. The management of a textile business, the accounts, the correspondence with suppliers, the contracts with clients, required functional literacy, and she had acquired it during her years in the household of a reasonably educated owner who had found a literate enslaved person useful. Aelia cannot read but can manage the entire logistical and financial operation of her pottery business through mental arithmetic and a system of marks and tallies that serves the same function as written records, and that she has been using for 40 years without error. Human beings find ways. Let me give you the specific quality of Roman light. Because we have discussed the lamp oil and the fire risk and the cost of lighting, but not the specific quality of the light that Roman people lived in. Before electric light, before gaslight, the primary sources of artificial light were oil lamps, candles, and torches. In Rome, oil lamps were the most common. The specific quality of oil lamp light is warm and orange, dimmer than electric light by several orders of magnitude, with the specific movement of a flame that gives it a quality of aliveness that fixed light sources lack. A room lit by oil lamps is a different environment from a room lit by electric lights. The shadows are more present. The bright areas are smaller. The faces of the people in the room have a quality that changes with the movement of the flame. The specific Roman oil lamp, the terracotta vessel with its spout for the wick and its handle for carrying and its decorative top, thousands of which have been recovered from Roman sites, was a beautiful object as well as a functional one. The better lamps were decorated with scenes in relief, mythological subjects, gladiatorial scenes, erotic imagery, daily life. You carried your light with you. You put it out to save the oil. You went asleep in the dark. And in the morning, the first light came from the outside, not a switch but the gradual brightening of the window, the quality of pre-dawn that the Romans were more familiar with than most modern people, because they did not have the option of making the room artificially bright, and so they were more aware of the natural light's specific qualities. Marcus notices the quality of light, not as an aesthetic exercise, as information. How far along is the morning? How much time do I have? Is it going to rain today? The light as a practical text. Let me give you the Roman relationship with the street. Because the street in Rome was not simply a transportation corridor, it was a living space. Romans conducted large portions of their daily life on the street. The apartments were small and often dark. The street had more space and more light. The shops opened to the street, not behind closed doors. The thermopolia were oriented toward the street, with their counters flush to the sidewalk. The street vendors, the fortune tellers, the barbers, the cobblers, the knife grinders, the many small service providers who served Rome's population, they worked on the street. The Roman street had a specific acoustic texture. The vendors calling their goods, the arguments and conversations of people conducting business, the children running, the animals, the water at the fountains, the ambient sound of a million people. It was noisy. It was also, in the specific way that densely populated urban spaces are alive in ways that quieter places are not, extraordinarily present. Walking through a Roman street in 60 AD was a total sensory experience in every direction simultaneously. There was too much to look at, to hear, to smell, to navigate. Modern urban environments try to provide something like this. Most of them fall short. Rome was the original. And now let me give you Rome from outside, as a final gift before sleep. Imagine arriving at Rome for the first time, approaching the city from the south on the Via Appia. You have traveled for days from somewhere, from Naples, from the Greek coast, from the eastern provinces, from wherever you are coming from. The road has been bringing you toward the city for hours. And then you see it. The city announces itself first in the smoke, the specific haze over a city of 1 million people, visible from a distance. Then the aqueducts crossing the landscape toward the city, those extraordinary engineering feats that still strike visitors today. Then the walls, Aurelian's walls, or the earlier walls of the Republican period. Then the specific skyline of the city, the temples on the Capitoline, the huge presence of the Colosseum, not yet built in 60 AD, but other monuments, the great temples, the forums, the specific Rome of the 7 hills compressed into one view. No ancient visitor, approaching Rome for the first time, described being unimpressed. They described the specific experience of understanding, for the first time, what the center of the world looked like from outside. And then they walked through the gate. And the sound and the smell and the crowd hit them. And they were in Rome. That is the experience we have been approximating tonight, from the inside. The smoke and the fish and the cartwheels and the baths and the building that is on fire. The center of the world. From the inside. Sleep. The lamp is out. The carts are on the streets. The fish market is almost open. Good night. Let me give you the specific characters of the street. Because the street cast, the recurring figures of the Roman street, was one of the things that gave neighborhoods their specific character. Every Roman neighborhood had its characters, not in the derogatory sense, but in the sense of specific individuals who were so regularly present in a specific place that they became part of the visual and social landscape of that place. The fortune teller who had set up at the corner near the market for 20 years and who was there every morning and who had, over 20 years, acquired a specific reputation for accuracy that may or may not have been deserved, but which was genuinely believed by a significant portion of the neighborhood. The barber who cut hair on the street and whose chair was one of the social centers of the neighborhood because barbers, in societies without telephones, were the information distribution nodes, the people to whom everyone talked while being cut, and whose shops accumulated more information about the neighborhood than almost any other institution. The lame beggar who had been at the temple steps for so many years that he was effectively a fixture, who was known by name to everyone in the neighborhood, whose specific ailment was the subject of periodic neighborhood debate. Is it genuine? Has it changed? Wasn't he walking differently last week? And who provided, in exchange for the coins people gave him, the specific social function of being the person to whom certain kinds of socially awkward information could be transmitted under the cover of charity. The water seller who operated at the fountain in the morning, filling people's vessels for a small fee so they didn't have to wait, who was a young man from the south of Italy, who was saving money to buy a small property, and who had calculated with reasonable accuracy how many more years this would take. Marcus knows all of these people. They are part of his Rome. Not friends, precisely. Not colleagues. Something more diffuse and more specific simultaneously. The specific social world of the daily encounter, the people whose faces and habits are as known as the layout of the street itself. Let me give you the animals. Because ancient Rome had animals in it in ways that modern cities mostly don't. The mules and oxen that moved goods through the streets at night, present at night, gone during the day, but their presence was felt in the manure they left and in the specific sound of iron shoes on cobblestones. The pigs. Roman pigs were, by several accounts, one of the more characteristic features of the urban landscape. They were kept in insulae by families who could afford to maintain one. They were occasionally managed loosely in the streets, and they had a specific relationship with the street's food waste that made them simultaneously useful. They consumed food waste and problematic. They were pigs on the street. The dogs. The Roman city had enormous numbers of dogs, not the tamed house pets primarily, but the street dogs, the dogs that lived in the margins of the urban environment, fed by street waste and occasional charity, present at the edge of the commercial life. Roman attitudes to dogs were pacific and complex. Dogs were protective symbols, the famous mosaic from Pompeii's house of the tragic poet, "Beware of the dog," and nuisances and companions. The birds. The specific birds of an ancient Roman city, the pigeons and the sparrows and the swallows that nested in the temple pediments and the insulae eaves, contributed to the ambient life of the city in ways that are unchanged in modern cities. The same birds, essentially. The same noise. The same specific presence of other life in the human-built environment. Marcus has a specific relationship with the pigeons that nest on his window ledge. He has been feeding them bread crumbs since he moved into this apartment. He has not named them. He feeds them every morning. This is not sentiment. It is just, he feeds the pigeons every morning. Let me give you the day of rest. Because the Roman calendar had specific rest days, not a weekly day off in the modern sense, but a complex of religious festivals and market days and dies nefasti, days on which certain kinds of public business could not be conducted, that provided the population with irregular breaks from the working routine. The most relevant for the daily life of Marcus was the Nundini, the market day that occurred every 8 days. On Nundini, the rural population was expected to come into the city for the market, and the urban population used the day for shopping, for social occasions, and for the various business that required the market's presence. There were also the major religious festivals, the Saturnalia in December, which involved gift-giving and a specific reversal of the normal social order in which enslaved people were served dinner by their owners, which has been interpreted as a safety valve for social tension. The Lupercalia, the various festivals of different gods throughout the year. And the games and the races, which were provided at public expense on the days associated with specific religious festivals, and which provided the de facto holiday entertainment that the population counted on. The Roman working year had more days off than a modern American worker's year, and fewer than many European workers today. This fact surprises people in both directions. Let me now give you the specific experience of the baths in more sensory detail. Because we discuss the baths as a social institution, but the specific physical experience deserves its own rendering. You enter the baths carrying the small toolkit, a strigil, the curved metal scraping tool, a small flask of oil, your change of clothes. The changing room, the apoditerium, is full of people also changing. You put your clothes in a niche. You are conscious of theft, as the sources suggest everyone was, and you arrange your clothes in a way that seems less likely to attract attention. You move into the frigidarium, the cold room, with its cold pool. This is the first stage, the bracing entry into the bathing sequence. The cold water is cold. In winter, it is very cold. The specific physiological jolt of the cold water is the body being asked to do something it did not necessarily want to do, and which rewards you for doing it about 30 seconds later when the blood response kicks in. Then the tepidarium, the warm room, with its warm air and its warm pools, the transitional space between cold and hot. This is where you often lingered, because the warm room had a quality of sustainable comfort that the extremes did not. Then the caldarium, the hot room, heated by the underfloor hypocaust system to temperatures that modern health and safety might have opinions about. The steam, the specific heavy warmth of a well-heated caldarium. This is where you applied the oil and used the strigil. The oil went on the skin. You sweated in the heat. The strigil came off the oil and the sweat, and the day's grime in a specific satisfying mechanical process. And then the attendant helped with the back, the places the strigil couldn't reach, and you were clean. The clean feeling after the Roman bath was not the squeaky clean of modern soap-based hygiene. It was the specific clean of oil-scraped skin after a hot room, your pores open, your skin smooth, your body genuinely well cleaned through the specific mechanism of heat and oil rather than soap. It was very effective. Marcus is standing in the caldarium. The heat is significant. He is thinking about nothing in particular. This is one of the gifts the baths gave to the Roman working population. The specific permission of the hot room, where the heat was too much for organized thought, and the only available mental state was the specific empty contentment of physical warmth after physical work. He has been here an hour already. He could stay longer. He stays a little longer. Then he dresses. He goes to Gaia's tavern. He is clean, warm, comfortable, and ready for wine. He is a Roman. This is what Romans did. Sleep. The lamp is out. Go. Odd night. Thank you for tonight. The Rome that nobody films is the Rome that the million people actually lived in, and it is more interesting than the marble version. Subscribe if Dull Tales is your late-night company. Leave a comment. Tell me what part of tonight's Rome surprised you. Tell me if you've been to Pompeii and stood at a thermopolium counter and thought about who stood there before you. Tell me what it felt like. Next time, we have more history to get through. More people, more daily lives, more ordinary worlds that were the actual texture of the historical record. But tonight, Marcus and Gaia and Rufus and Lydia and Aelia and the fish market and the baths. The noisy, smelly, wonderful Rome. Good night.